All right, so welcome to this conversation with Birgitta Wahlberg, who is the co-founder and former president of the Finnish Animal Rights Law Society. Hopefully I'm getting that right. And also a lecturer in public law at, I hope I'm going to say this correctly, Åbo Academy. I'm so sorry for any Finnish viewers that I've offended with my pronunciation there. And Birgitta is also involved in the putting together of a proposal for the Finnish constitution, which is super interesting. And I actually saw her speak and present at the Vegan and Animal Rights Conference in Manchester early in the year. So, Birgitta, thank you so much for coming on and talking to me about this. To just kick things off, are you able to give a brief overview of what this proposal is, and then we'll go specifically into the topic we're going to talk about?
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation for your pod. I'm happy to be here. It's my pleasure. So, about the proposal for the Finnish constitution, the idea started from many years ago, actually. I have been defending my doctoral dissertation in 2011, and already before or during the work with my thesis, I was wondering how it's possible that we have more legislation to protect animals than ever before in our history, human history. And at the same time, we know that the law is not actually protecting even the fundamental things or interests of animals. And we are, at least quantitatively, we are killing and slaughtering more animals than ever before and destroying their habitats. And the list is never ending what we are doing. So that was something that was, of course, really annoying. And I also, during my doctoral thesis, I was working on different farms, couple of weeks, and I visited almost all the slaughterhouses on southwest coast in Finland. And it was devastating to see how we treat and handle and how we use, exploit, oppress animals. So everything started maybe from this anxiety over how we are treating animals today. At the same time, I was participating, and especially after my dissertation, I was participating in animal law conferences and met colleagues around the globe. And one of them were Stephen Weiss, who I suppose that many of you knew or know. Now he died a couple of years ago or 1 year ago, but he was talking on concrete terms about animal rights and especially maybe fundamental animal rights, but from a personhood perspective, which would not fit into our Finnish legal system, because we are a mixed system of both civil law system and common law system. So the legal language, so to say, is different. So it couldn't be, the work of non-human rights project in US wouldn't be applicable here in Finland to make it to legal provisions, so to say, or legal actions on behalf of animals. So I was thinking that what could we do in terms of our legal system to promote fundamental animal rights alongside those of humans, not forgetting humans either, but to have them alongside those of humans. And then also what I noticed earlier years, that we often in law context, we are talking about animal rights, but then to really exactly or to phrase it in legal terms. So what would the content be? Then I couldn't find the answers that what could they mean and how could we write a provision. And therefore I contacted my colleagues both here in Finland and also in Sweden, but then we separated each other because this has to be done in the context of the own legal system. So the Finnish group continued, and we developed and wrote the proposal that is at the moment at the Constitutional Committee in the Finnish Parliament. And the proposal, now to your question, this was the background. The work started late 2015, and it took us almost 2 years to write the proposal. So it's an cooperation with natural scientists, with other legal scholars, lawyers, judges, to put it together as it is today. And it consists of 5 sections, where each of them have several subsections. And in the proposal, we have also part which is a rationale to all of the subsections and the content of the sections. The 2 first sections are more general sections where the sentience of animals are recognized, that sentient beings have intrinsic value, and also the main legal principles that should be like a frame around the protection of animals and all the both fundamental, simple, and welfare requirements. So fundamental and simple rights and also the welfare requirements on all level of law. And the main legal principles are the principle of precaution. So if we can't be certain that an animal is sentient, then that would be the starting point, that all animals are kept as sentient, if not other can be proved. And then also the principle of necessity, which means that the fundamental rights of animals cannot be limited if it's not for the safeguarding of human or animal fundamental rights. And the principle of necessity, I stop here for a moment because it's so important, because the principle of necessity is also combined with the right to life, which is laid down both in section 3 concerning fundamental animal rights of wild animals, in other words, those sentient beings that are living in and of nature, and then section 4, which laid down the fundamental animal rights of those animals that are dependent on human care. And in both of these sections, there are subsections stating that animals have a right to life, which is not absolute as our human life is protected by the human rights and freedoms. So it can be animal life could be justified and taken if it would be for the benefit and safeguarding of an animal's right, or to protect a species or an animal individual, or it would be necessary for human survival. So these would be the only reasons how we could take a life, justify taking a life. So this is principle of necessity. And then third principle is the principle of precaution, which is meaning that proportionality, meaning that we shouldn't limit the fundamental animal rights more than it's necessary to reach the goal with the limitation. both in time and content. So these are the two first sections, and as I already mentioned, section 3 and 4 are more concrete, the material substance sections for the fundamental animal rights, both for wild animals and those animals dependent on human care. And then we come to the topic of today, the fifth section of the proposal, which is a prohibition on breeding, which is not either an absolute prohibition. And as I mentioned at the presentation in Manchester at the conference, this section was the most difficult section to write the proposal on. I was the chairperson for the working group, and it was really difficult to get people together and agree to come a solution. So I would say that how the section 5 is now written is some kind of compromise, but it is in line with what we already have had in our law by the Animal Protection Act from 1996, which is not in force anymore because we have a new Animal Welfare Act from January 2024, from last year. But the content in the proposal, section 5, is in line with what we already have had in our law, so to say, but which had been almost an empty provision, because as I think everyone knows, we as humans are breeding sick animals. We are breeding animals to benefit our lives, even if it would be on the cost of the animal's welfare. And so there is a lot of issues to do with the breeding, but this is a maybe too long introduction to what we are going to talk today, but this gives a bigger picture of the proposal. And I would also like to say that it is meant that the proposal is read as a whole, because it's built up like the sections are building upon each other. So, for example, the principles I mentioned, they are impacting also on breeding, on section 5, and also the fundamental rights laid down in, for example, section 4, subsection 1, on natural behavior as a fundamental right for animals that are dependent on human care, that has also an impact on breeding and the content in section 5. So therefore, one actually need to read the whole proposal and the rationale to really understand the whole content of the proposal.
I wanted to, and I'm going to read out a short section from it. So apologies for having to read something out. But in section 5, it specifies that an animal may not be bred in such a manner that the breeding would cause the animal or the animal's offspring physical or psychological harm or prevent the natural behavior of the offspring. And I think you've kind of already gestured at the answer to this question, but I just wanted to ask, what in how the proposal is now, as it exists now, what instances of breeding would be prohibited and which wouldn't?
So, as you said in your question, the content of section 5 actually it's how would I say, it covers 4 or 5 points. There is 5 main points, and one of them is that the meaning, the rationale of the section 5 is to safeguard that the best interests of the animal is taken into account. And the meaning is also to ensure that the fundamental rights of animals laid down in the proposal is safeguarded. Secondly, that only healthy animals are used in breeding when we are breeding. So the discussion in the group was that the breeding, because we have bred so sick animals, that the breeding could also help animals in future. If the outgoing point is the interest of an animal, the fundamental rights, and that those animals that are used in breeding are healthy. So that was the two first points. And then there is two prohibitions written into the proposal. The first one is that if an animal is inseminated in breeding, which is a common way to breed animals, it's prohibited to do to young animals too often or against the animal's will. And this applies both to female and male animals. And then the last prohibition is that it's prohibited to attempt to alter an animal's appearance, ability, or performance. And an example of ability could be, for example, to breed cows that are giving or producing so much milk that it's not healthy or good for the cow's welfare or well-being. And of course, the same applies to the cow's offspring. And we need also to have, how would I say, more precise information of that if we breed animals, that even if they are healthy and so to say in good welfare, we need to somehow in line with the principle of necessity, we have to motivate and explain why it's necessary to breed. And I think that's really important to, and here the meaning of the principle of necessity truly comes to a point that only to breed for human interest or for selling or whatever, that kind of breeding, I don't know how we could motivate it in so it could be justified within the scope of the principle of necessity. But more precise examples, I have difficulties to give, and of course it's dependent then on the legislator on ordinary law level to really be precise. But the last point in the section 5 is also that it's in the rationale, it's pointed out that because breeding is impacting so fundamentally on the animal's fundamental rights, it should be also regulated really exactly and precisely in the Finnish criminal code. So with that, we have been thinking in a compromised manner that at least at this point, we can do something better than what we are doing now. And with uplifting Section 5 from the ordinary law level, from the Animal Welfare Act to the constitutional level, it gives, of course, the provision and the content in the provision more legal strength and gives a position to animals that is not seen before. Because now the fundamental human rights are on the constitutional level, which is, of course, the highest level of the norm hierarchy, and the animal protection legislation is regulated on the mainly on the ordinary law level in the Animal Welfare Act. So therefore, we think that this provision could give an strength that at least we could get hold of the breeding somehow in a better manner.
Yeah, because I can, and I think when I came to see you talk at VARC, I mentioned in my question that depending on how you read the proposal, you can draw different conclusions from it. So I think when you gave the talk at VARC, you used the example of breeds of dogs that are born with flat noses. In that the proposal can be read in such a way where animal breeding is generally seen as okay unless there is some sort of unusually sort of harmful aspect of the animal's anatomy, so that their ability to even live a life that is somewhat, reasonable is inhibited, right? As is the case with those dogs. They find it quite hard to breathe in many instances. And that's sort of one way that you could read it. And I'd imagine that would be the way that it would be read by people who want to continue to breed animals, because then it gives them, a sort of way out. But then there's also the way that you can read it when the proposal is saying that the offspring coming to physical or psychological harm. Well, all of us come to some physical or psychological harm as humans, and obviously animals as well, because their lives tend to be much worse than ours. And so someone could also interpret it in that more all-encompassing way. And I wondered if you think that the bill, if it does get actually implemented in its current form, it's very likely going to be read in that narrower sense. But do you think it would provide an opportunity to then, it's a foothold that can be built upon so that the interpretation of it can be expanded over time?
Yes, thank you. That's an excellent question and topic to discuss, because that's typical and, should I say, natural for constitutional provisions to be really broad. So at the same time, when, as you say, the interpretation can be narrow, it can also open up for more broad interpretation of the content in the constitutional provision. And that's exactly what the aim or the objective of the whole proposal is, that we have to have provisions on constitutional level that are living in the, how should I say, living in time, so to say, and also giving a possibility to, for example, animal advocates and lawyers, judges, to interpret in a situation of conflict, taking into account the animal's interest, and also to manage to put some limitation on human rights, which is not actually possible to do now when the human fundamental rights and freedoms are on the constitutional level regulated or stipulated, and the animal protection provisions are on ordinary law level. So already as an outgoing point is an halting system where the animal status are so weak in relation to humans that the outcome is what we see today, what we are living today, and what animals most importantly, are living and facing in their everyday life and death. So I think that if the proposal is recognized and legislated in the Finnish constitution as it is now built up, and now I'm talking more about the systematic approach of the whole proposal. As I pointed out and highlighted from the beginning, that we need to read it as a whole because it's the one section is building up on each other. So I think that most likely, as you said, the narrow interpretation will be the line those who want to breed animals have. But at the same time, the provision and the proposal as a whole opens up for the representative of the animal to also bring up cases and to argue on behalf of an animal at the authorities, animal protection authorities, and in relation to our MPs, our legislators, when laws or acts on ordinary law level are regulated, or on ordinance law level. So I think it opens up opportunities to discuss also animal breeding from such a point of view that we actually cannot reach legally at the moment, according to our current laws. So I hope, I hope that we will end up in a situation where the proposal is part of our constitution, because then and that we have representatives whose task, the main task of those, are to represent and talk on behalf of animals. At the same time, some part of me is saying, okay, if we ban breeding, and would that mean, or this is more a question, would that mean that animals would reproduce freely? Because I think it's also combined with sterilization of animals and somehow to limit their reproduction. I don't have any answer. This is just questions I struggle with in my own head.
Yeah, no, it's interesting that you brought up that sort of tension, because it came into my mind when you were, one of the sections is a prohibition on breeding, which, if taken to its most expansive interpretation, would be any human breeding of other animals. But then also somewhere in the proposal is a right for for animals to be able to sort of express their natural way of living, right? But included in that is for animals to reproduce, because naturally part of their way of living would be to reproduce amongst themselves. And so that leaves a sort of odd situation where humans wouldn't be bringing animals into existence, but there would still be some animals presumably in human care, like, for example, on animal sanctuaries, that, it then kind of leaves open the question of like, well, these animals, they are still dependent on us, and we're not breeding them. But if they're breeding amongst themselves, and they remain dependent on us, this is sort of, it's a sort of the next moral question that's got to be asked, right? Do we go from not breeding them to intervening in their lives and, trying to avoid them breeding amongst each other? And I know obviously that's not in the scope of this proposal, but it's a sort of related, interesting question, and it could be something that animal law in the future can explore. One thing that you've kind of referenced multiple times already that I wanted to ask about was, you said that in drawing up this proposal, the most discussed or debated or hard to pin down section was the section on breeding. And you've kind of explained, or at least referenced, some of the views people had. Some people were sort of abolitionists when it came to breeding, and others were saying that, you know, maybe some breeding is permissible, but not in the way that it's currently being done. Can you just go a bit more into what that discussion between the different perspectives was like, and why do you think this section was the one that stirred up the most discussion?
I don't remember anymore exactly how the discussions went, but I think that that this section was so difficult because, as I said, I think it's linked with sterilization and limitation of the sexuality of other sentient beings, the reproduction of every being, which I think it's a fundamental need of most of the beings, not maybe everyone, but most of the beings. So I think it's as an outgoing point, it's also in relation to animals, it's already anthropocentric. However we or whatever we do, it's anthropocentric. Even the decision to not do anything might be anthropocentric, human-centered. So, because it's a decision we make in relation to someone else. Then, of course, we know from natural science that species regulate themselves depending of the environmental situation, pandemics or illnesses. So somehow I think that if we could just leave some parts of the globe to animals, the balance should be sorted out. Of course, not without suffering, because suffering is part of life, every life. But I think that this section was so difficult because it's linked to so big other questions, and we don't have the answers, because all the other sections were in relation to this topic. It was quite clear how to express it in legal terms, because a lot of the content in, for example, section 3 and 4 is already part of the Animal Welfare Act. Not everything, but almost. So it's already, it was more easy somehow, and it's so fundamental that everyone needs water, for example, or something to drink and eat to survive. So it was, and you know, the discussions about natural behavior, it's so fundamental. But breeding is somehow, as an outgoing point, already so anthropocentric. And we have done so much bad things with breeding towards other sentient beings that I think that makes it so difficult, because there is no clear answers.
You kind of somewhat referenced this, but I was wondering if, because the prohibition on breeding animals, of humans breeding other animals, I can kind of see multiple motivations that someone may have for opposing humans breeding animals. And I kind of wanted to, I'd listed like 4 of them down. I'm sure there are others. And I wondered if you had a view on which of these would be the most successful framing legally. So some of the ways that I can see someone oppose the breeding of animals is, for example, you know, breeding animals uses them as a means to human ends, right? They're just a means to our own ends, and that's something that, you know, in many people's ethics, they're opposed to using others as a means to our own ends. Another example is it just perpetuates animal status as property, right? So obviously, if animals weren't bred anymore, there wouldn't be any animals brought into existence for us to use as property. I guess that wouldn't stop us going and taking wild animals, but it would at least stop us bringing new animals into the world as property. Another one is just the fact that breeding animals into existence will bring them into a life where they will suffer to some degree, right? And so it's maybe sort of like avoiding, maybe sparing animals of suffering by not creating them in the first place. And then the final one I thought of is that breeding animals will likely keep them in a state of dependency on us. And there seems like something fundamentally unjust about creating someone into a situation where they're dependent on you, especially when there's a very bad history of you abusing that dependency, right? And currently we obviously still abuse that dependency. So there may be other motivations that someone could have as well, but I wondered, do you think any of those four, or maybe any other particular motivation, is one that lends itself more to a legal argument? And I don't know if you personally resonate with any of them specifically as well.
Actually, I resonate with all of them very well. But from a legal point of view, what I think it's important with both to educate becoming lawyers and current lawyers and legal scholars in animal law, and to have recognized fundamental animal rights. Why it's so important, I think there is two reasons. First of all, animal law is that field of law that is looking at legal questions from an animal perspective, from a zoocentric perspective, which is including also human species, opposite to anthropocentric, which is only focusing on the human species, excluding all the other species. So and I think at the core of animal law is the interest of animals. So to switch that way of thinking and to look at legal questions, because in all other fields of law, you don't actually need to take anything else than human interests into account. Maybe a little bit on the level of species in the field of environmental law, but also that is mainly focused on the interest of humans. So animal law education, I think, is so important to develop more in the coming years, so that the switch of thinking happens within the legal discipline or subject. And then in relation to breeding and the Section 5 and our proposal and your claims, I think only with recognition of fundamental animal rights, already that makes the legal status of animals to change in relation to humans. Partly because it's on a constitutional level. So it's on the same level that the human rights and freedoms. So that is already an statement that changes the legal status of animals. You had a claim of property, or I take the first one first, human ends. With the content in this proposal, I think that it's challenging, even if in the proposal there is the section about fundamental rights for animals dependent on human care. I see that section not as an reflection of exploitation and oppression. I think I see that section as care and safeguarding someone else's interests. So even if we wouldn't own or have animals as property, I think we need to care. And there will always be animals that are dependent on our care. and I think there is always animals that can be helped by humans. So I read that section more from an caring, maybe even loving perspective, instead of the use or abuse or exploitation or oppression of animals under human care. And I think that what we now use as the word property, now in legal terms, the word property means that you can sell the animal, you can buy an animal, you can give an animal away, or you can euthanize or you can slaughter an animal. But property could mean, in legal terms, also something else. It could mean guardianship, or it could be meaning care, or there could be more requirements on property when it comes to animals. It doesn't mean that all the property should be changed, but in relation to animals, it could be. For example, it could be required that if you are a caretaker of an animal, it's your property and you must have enough money to safeguard the veterinarian care. You need to have enough knowledge to be the caretaker of that animal. So there could be other, and I think the sky is the limit for what all requirements there could be. But when the requirements are shifted from what we want to have from our animals to the animal's interest, I think the word property could also mean something good, instead of what we now linked with, in legal terms, with property. It's often something negative from an animal perspective. So the word itself, I don't think it's so important. It's more what we are proposing or writing into the law as binding requirements or prohibitions or rights. Then, of course, there will be conflict situations when an human's interest are conflicting with the animal interests. And then, as today, when my human interest is conflicting with your human interest or right, then in the end of the day, it's the court who is deciding what kind of interpretation is enough for the safeguarding of our both interests. And that will be also the case in the conflict situations between human and animal interest, I think. So we are not, it's impossible to come away or end all the conflict situations, but there has to be legal tools, and the content in the what we call here written law. I think, do you use black letter law? Is that the right term in
I'm
your
not
country?
knowledgeable
Okay.
enough about law to know.
but what is written into the law book, so to say. So that is the important thing. Whatever we call it, if we call it property or whatever, but we need to phrase it so it's not an use, exploitation and oppression for human ends, or property as we know property status in law today. So we need to change that. Then to your third claim about to breed animals to a life of suffering. Somehow I think that's also quite anthropocentric thinking, in that sense that, I mean, suffering, or at least pain in some on some level, it's important also for our survival. Without that, we couldn't survive if we wouldn't know what suffering and pain is. So, and who are we to decide? Who are we to decide who can live or not? But this is also combined with breeding, sterilization, reproduction. So I might don't have any clear um, opinion on that, but somehow my immediately reaction is that who are we to say how the lives go, and there can be a lot of well-being and welfare even if there is unhealthiness or also suffering. So as we know from our own lives. So, and the fourth was the dependency on humans. And I think, as I said already, that I think there will always be an dependency, both from the animal side but also from human side on animals. So, but if it's built on respect and co-living instead of oppression, then I think, and that is also reflected in the text, in the law, in the provisions, in the content of the law, then I think we are doing the best we can at the moment, at least.
I also wanted to ask about, I've noticed, I'm not sure how many, but I noticed one recently, which I think I sent you a link to. I don't know if you had a chance to look at it. And I think I've noticed maybe one or two in the past, animal rights groups or groups of animal advocates that have drafted up some sort of mock bill of rights for animals, or just a simple list of rights they think animals should have. And some of these there's actually some weight behind, and it's sort of being presented to governments or legislatures like what you're involved in. And then some it's a simple website that's been put up, and it's maybe more like a manifesto almost. I've seen in some of these lists of rights for animals that some animal advocates actually include a right for animals to reproduce explicitly, which I don't think necessarily conflicts with the prohibition on breeding, because the prohibition on breeding is just for humans, right? The human of breeding of animals. But it could be that in these other lists of rights, the right to reproduce for animals is more a negative right, in that humans should not be, intervening to try and stop animals from reproducing. Do you see any... Because I know we kind of mentioned it before about, if there's a prohibition on breeding, there's still going to be some animals, like, for example, in sanctuaries, that may breed amongst themselves. And at the moment, at least in our discussion, we've kind of left that as an open thing. There's no particular answer that we've presented. But it seems like there are some animal groups that are presenting an answer and saying, actually, no, these animals should have the right to reproduce, and it would be wrong for us to intervene. And I can imagine one simple example is on a sanctuary, right? Do you have any sort of thoughts on that, or worries about people trying to push for animals to have a right to reproduce at this early stage, when animal rights law, I may be ignorant, but seems still relatively young? Or do you think that, it is just another group of animal advocates that have come to their opinion and they're pushing for this, and let's see where it goes? Or do you have any concerns about it? What do you generally think about that?
I think first of all are they on the websites or proposals for the legislators or politicians? It doesn't matter, but I think all the proposals on animal rights, is it on as fundamental rights or simple rights? It doesn't matter. I think it reflects the importance of that we need to move forward from the welfare requirements and the welfare paradigm the law is built upon, and we need to change so that the reality of animals are different. Concerning reproduction, as I said already, I think breeding, sterilization or castration, and reproduction, they are all linked together. And it's so difficult questions. Immediately, I think that reproduction is a topic where I feel immediately, who are we as humans to limit or to say who can reproduce or not? At the same time, I don't have enough knowledge in relation to all species under human dominion at the moment, or in human care at the moment, or those we are breeding systematically as it is now. And now I'm referring mostly maybe to those animals we are using in food production. I actually don't know. Is it the sexual act that is important, or is it, for example, to take care of the right to take care of the offspring? That is the most important. So is it the reproduction? Somehow I think that it's built in our every being's nature, so to say, to be reproductive of the own species. But with humans, I know it's not the case. So I'm not sure. Is it the case for every animal being to reproduce new beings, or is it more the sexual act or sexual need that is the most important thing? So I don't know. I don't have, as a legal scholar, I don't have enough knowledge to so if I would be a lawyer and have a case where I should know on behalf, I should need to talk on behalf of some, for example, a cow in a sanctuary, for example, then of course I would turn to natural scientists and natural science and try to figure out what is the science knowing today. And maybe I could find something there to argue against or for reproduction or sterilization. I don't know what the science is saying today, and I don't think we have an answer which is covering all the species and all the individuals in the species. So I think with these kind of questions, we need to have provision that is so broad that the door is open for argumentation against or for reproduction, and it has to live with the science.
One of the things that you said there that was really interesting, which I hadn't fully appreciated, was that before we can really understand how or what the most appropriate way to interpret certain rights for animals is, is we have to understand their interests more. And one of the ways that came to mind from what you were talking about was we can maybe take a sort of very generic view of animals as saying, like they have an interest in their natural behaviors, which broadly is going to be true, but there are going to be some natural behaviors that actually animals may not have an interest in, and this came up for me when you said it could be the case that other animals are like humans in that there is a variation across the species in how much of an interest the individual has maybe in raising young. And you gave the distinction between, well, is it the sexual act that they have more of an interest in, and then maybe reproduction just happens and they learn to live with it, or do they actually have an interest in raising young that already exists before the young have been born? And that was really interesting, because if the case is that they actually have more of an interest in the sexual act, then sterilization wouldn't be as much of an infringement on their rights and interests, because they don't actually really have that interest in raising young. And actually, in a way, sterilization could help secure their interests, because if they engage in the sexual act and then reproduce inadvertently, that could be a big burden on them, because then they've got these young to look afterwards, and maybe that restricts them in how they can behave. But then, on the other hand, if they do have this interest in raising young, then sterilizing them is going to be frustrating their interests in their natural behavior a lot more. So it was really interesting what you were saying, that in some ways the understanding of animals and their interests precedes the sort of legal protections and rights that we want to construct for them. And I guess I had sort of like subconsciously appreciated that a bit, but I hadn't realized how significant it is until you were saying that. So I found that really interesting. The one very quick final question I had for you was, what is the current situation at the moment with the proposal? Can you remind people, and maybe how hopeful are you for its adoption in the future?
Yes, so at the moment, the proposal on fundamental animal rights is on the Constitutional Committee at the Finnish Parliament, and we are waiting for a public hearing, which we don't know the date yet, but we are hoping that it would be at latest next autumn. I really hope from bottom of my heart that the Finnish legislator, the MPs, are brave enough to take a decision to next time the constitution is opened up, so to say, they take in the fundamental animal rights, because I think it's an historical thing to do for the benefit both of humans and animals and our shared globe, because we know that when one country is doing something, someone else is coming after. So I really, really, really hope that our Finnish legislator is brave enough and takes in the catalogue of rights that is proposed for now.
Well, thank you again so much for talking to me about this and giving up your time.
Thank you for having me, and all the best.